The fog rolled in thick and heavy on the outskirts of the small town, swallowing the trees and fields in a ghostly shroud. The moon, barely visible through the dense mist, cast an eerie, pale light over the landscape. It was the kind of night that made you feel like something was watching you, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And on this particular night, something was. A young couple, Emily and David, drove down the narrow, winding road that led through the woods. They had been on a road trip, exploring the countryside and getting away from the stress of their busy lives. The plan had been to find a cozy bed and breakfast and spend a quiet evening together, but as the fog grew thicker, they realized they had taken a wrong turn. Emily squinted at the GPS on her phone, but the signal was lost, and the screen showed nothing but a spinning circle. "I think we're lost," she said, her voice laced with concern. David nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Yeah, I think you're right. We should have hit the main road by now." The road seemed to narrow even further, the trees closing in on them like twisted, skeletal fingers. The fog was so thick now that the headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. David slowed the car to a crawl, afraid of what might be waiting around the next bend. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily whispered, glancing out the window. The woods seemed to be alive with shadows that danced and flickered in the periphery of her vision. "Maybe we should turn around." David was about to agree when they rounded a bend and saw something up ahead. A light, faint and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the breeze. "Look," Emily said, pointing. "There's a house." Indeed, through the thick fog, they could just make out the shape of a building, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. It looked old, the kind of place that had stood for centuries, weathering countless storms and the passage of time. A wooden sign hung crookedly near the gate, but the words were too worn to read. "Maybe they can help us," David suggested, though there was hesitation in his voice. Something about the house didn't feel right, but what choice did they have? They were lost, and the idea of driving blindly through the fog was even less appealing. Emily nodded, and David turned the car onto the gravel driveway. The tires crunched loudly against the stones, the sound echoing in the silence. They pulled up in front of the house and killed the engine. For a moment, they just sat there, staring at the darkened windows. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her hand resting on the door handle. David took a deep breath. "We don't have many options. Let's just see if they have a phone or something." They got out of the car, the fog immediately wrapping around them like a damp, suffocating blanket. The house loomed over them, tall and foreboding, its wooden walls weathered and gray. The lantern that had drawn them in was hanging from the porch, its light flickering weakly as if it could go out at any moment. David knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the house. They waited, but there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Maybe no one's home," Emily suggested, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as they were about to turn back to the car, the door creaked open, revealing a small, elderly woman. Her face was lined with age, her eyes pale and milky, as if she were blind. But there was something unsettling about the way she stared at them, as if she could see right through them. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy and dry. "We're sorry to bother you," David began, "but we're lost. We were hoping you might have a phone we could use or some directions to the nearest town." The woman smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Come in, come in. It's not safe out there in the fog." Emily and David exchanged a glance, but the woman stepped aside, holding the door open wider. They hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, sealing them in. The interior of the house was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering on a wooden table in the hallway. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the floor creaked underfoot as they followed the woman into the parlor. A fire crackled weakly in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. "Please, sit down," the woman said, gesturing to an old, worn sofa. "I'll fetch you some tea." David and Emily sat, the cushions sagging under their weight. The room smelled of dust and something else, something faintly metallic that made Emily's stomach churn. She glanced around nervously, her eyes settling on a portrait hanging above the fireplace. It depicted a man and a woman, both dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces stern and unsmiling. "That must be the lady's family," Emily whispered to David. "Yeah, maybe," David replied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The old woman returned with a tray of teacups and a teapot, her movements slow and deliberate. She set the tray down on the table in front of them and poured the tea, the liquid dark and steaming. "Drink up," she said, handing them each a cup. "It'll warm you right up." Emily hesitated, staring down at the tea. It was a deep, almost black color, and the smell was strong, bitter. She wasn't sure she wanted to drink it, but she didn't want to be rude either. David took a sip first, and then, seeing that nothing happened to him, Emily followed suit. The tea was bitter and earthy, not at all like the kind she was used to. But it did warm her, spreading heat through her cold limbs. "Thank you," David said, setting his cup down. "We appreciate your hospitality." The woman smiled again, that same unsettling smile. "It's no trouble at all. I don't get many visitors these days." Emily glanced around the room again, noticing for the first time the strange artifacts that decorated the shelves. There were old dolls, their glass eyes staring blankly, and jars filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. The more she looked, the more unsettled she became. "Are you here all alone?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman's smile faded, and for a moment, her expression grew dark. "Oh, no. I'm not alone. My family is here." David and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. "We didn't see anyone else," David said cautiously. "They're around," the woman replied, her tone cryptic. "They're always around." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She suddenly felt very exposed, like they were being watched from every corner of the room. She wanted to leave, to get back to the safety of their car, but something told her it wouldn't be that easy. "Perhaps we should be going," David suggested, his voice tense. "We don't want to impose." The woman's smile returned, but it was colder now, more menacing. "Oh, but you've only just arrived. Surely you can stay a while longer. It's not safe to go out in the fog." David opened his mouth to protest, but the door to the parlor suddenly swung open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken and hollow, and his clothes hung loosely from his thin frame. "Ah, here's my son," the woman said, her voice filled with strange pride. "This is Thomas." Thomas said nothing, just stared at them with those hollow eyes. Emily felt a wave of nausea wash over her, and she gripped David's hand tightly. "We really should be going," David said, standing up. But as he did, the room seemed to shift around them, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The old woman's smile twisted into something cruel. "I'm afraid it's too late for that. You see, once you enter this house, you can never leave." Emily and David backed away, but the room seemed to close in on them. The walls pressed closer, the air growing thick and suffocating. The fire in the hearth flared up, casting grotesque shapes on the walls. The man, Thomas, took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "You belong to the house now," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house, muffled as if they were deep underwater. David grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the door, but it slammed shut before they could reach it. The old woman laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the room. "You can never leave," she repeated, her voice distorted, as if it were coming from a great distance. Emily and David were trapped, the room spinning around them, the shadows reaching out with clawed hands. The house groaned and creaked, as if it were alive, feeding on their fear. The last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them whole was the portrait above the fireplace. The faces of the man and woman had changed. Their expressions twisted into grotesque grins, their eyes glinting with malice. And then, everything went black. The next morning, the fog had lifted, revealing the old house standing silent and still on the edge of the woods. There was no sign of the young couple, no trace of their car. The house stood alone, as it always had, waiting for its next visitors to stumble upon it. For those who entered the house, never left. Their screams echoed through the halls, unheard by the outside world, as the house fed on their terror, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. And so, the house waited, patient and hungry, for the next lost travelers to find their way to its door, drawn in by the faint, flickering light of a lantern that never went out.